I'm going to talk about design emergency. And all of my work is committed to encouraging people to take a more eclectic and enlightened view of design by looking beyond its stereotypical role as a styling and promotional tool, something that blings up hoodies and trainers, to being a means with which we can address our grave and complex social, political, and ecological challenges. Now, this is a tough assignment because design is a complex and elusive phenomenon that has adopted many different meanings at different times and in different contexts, which has left it prone to muddles, misunderstandings, and cliches. Yet in all its many guises, I believe that it has always had one elemental role, and that's as this. It's an agent of change that can interpret changes of any type by helping us to make sense of what is happening around us and to turn it to our advantage, whether they're social, political, economic, scientific, technological, cultural changes, or whatever, to ensure that they will affect us positively rather than negatively. Now, I've championed this vision of design as a journalist, writing a weekly design column for the New York Times for over a decade, and as the author of books like Hello World, Where Design Meets Life, and as Amelia has mentioned, Design as an Attitude. And for the last 5 years, I've done so on a new medium, Instagram, first on my own Instagram feed, and for the last 2 years on this, Design Emergency, a research platform I co-founded with a friend, Paola Antonelli, Senior Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And Design Emergency, having started on Instagram, is now a book which went on sale last week, Design Emergency, Building a Better Future. So first of all, why Instagram? Because it would be completely fair to question whether it's a valid research vehicle or not. And I have to admit that I was deeply dubious about it when it launched, but a friend, the curator Hans-Ulrich Obrist, was so convinced that I'd enjoy it that he eventually ground me down and convinced me to experiment with it. And I decided to use Instagram as a project to try to persuade people to see design as I do, as a ubiquitous force that affects every area of our lives, our society, and our ecology. So I chose a theme for each week: housing, water, trees, gender politics, circles, death, the color blue, whatever. And every day I posted about a different design interpretation of it. My objective was to use the post to demonstrate design's diversity and its power in different domains. Though from a personal perspective, it also enabled me to indulge my curiosity about contemporary design and design history by offering many research opportunities. And that aspect of Instagram became particularly enticing when a major global challenge erupted, and I could learn about it by investigating the design response. And I did this by running regular weekly series on major social or environmental issues, but by far the most ambitious of them was the Design in a Pandemic series I launched just over 2 years ago at the start of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, if you think back then, it already seems like 5 or 10 years ago, not just 2, but it was a terrifying time because it was very chaotic and very confusing, largely because no one, not even the world's most eminent scientists and doctors, knew what this strange, lethal coronavirus was, where it had come from, or crucially, how to treat it. Now, during that confusion, it seemed to me that design was emerging as a rare good news story, as the media celebrated examples of design ingenuity in the fight against COVID, whether it was the development of urgently needed emergency ventilators for hard-pressed hospitals. So the nature of the design responses meant that the media was suddenly depicting design in a very different way, as an empowering and responsible agent of change, just as I saw it. In short, it was demonstrating design's ability to tackle urgent problems and thereby promise to secure or help to secure the public confidence and political support that would be needed if design was to be empowered to play a much more ambitious role in our lives. I searched for exemplary design responses to COVID-19 all over the world, initially intending to post about them once a day for a week. But by the end of that week, there were so many other examples I wanted to write about that I ran the series for another week and another and another. And I also introduced a parallel series of an occasional history of design emergencies, which analysed often unacknowledged design responses to past disasters like fires, earthquakes, plagues, and World Wars I and II. Again and again, these historic disasters had acted as catalysts for radical redesign and reconstruction programs, and Paula and I fervently hoped that COVID would do the same. Now, during this period, the first few weeks of the pandemic, we regularly discussed this and became increasingly convinced that the anguish and tragedy of COVID-19 and the generous and optimistic design response to it could be a game changer for design. And we decided to build on my research from my Instagram feed with Paula's research at MoMA by co-founding Design Emergency as a more intensive research platform. Now, our next decision was to ask our friend, the brilliant graphic designer Frith Kerr, to design a visual identity for the new platform, which she and her team at Studio Frith in London did brilliantly by developing this engaging, imposing, and instantly recognizable identity defined by this beautiful shade of blue, the lovely juxtaposition of typography, and an alarm symbol. So we began by running weekly Instagram live interviews, each of which was 30 minutes long. Here's the design emergency grid very early in the project. Each of them with one of the designers who we saw as global leaders in the COVID relief effort. Our hope was that by sharing exemplary responses or design responses, we'd help to ensure that design would be at the forefront of the radical redesign and reconstruction of our lives post-pandemic. So what did we choose as the most compelling COVID design projects? To be frank, we were spoilt for choice because designers, architects, coders, illustrators, engineers, and their collaborators displayed such courage, creativity, resourcefulness, and dedication at this very difficult time. Among the designers we interviewed was the co-designer of this, Alyssa Eckert, a medical illustrator at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, who together with her colleague Dan Higgins was charged with creating a visualization of SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19, on the 21st of January, the day after the CDC activated its Emergency Response Center for COVID. 10 days later, working at breakneck speed, they completed, signed off, and launched this visualization that Alyssa described as giving a face to the unknown and was swiftly recognized all over the world as the spiky blob for obvious reasons. Now, medical illustrations like this must be scientifically precise. If they're not, they wouldn't be credible, but their designers have some license for expression. Alyssa and Dan were asked to ensure that the public would sense the danger posed by COVID, so they exaggerated the scariest element of SARS-CoV-2, the red spike or S proteins that attach it to human cells, thereby spreading contagion by making them more numerous, bigger, and spikier, and in a scarier shade of red than they actually were. Now, within days, this image had, of course, become ubiquitous. It's now one of the most recognizable images of our time and the most famous medical illustration in history. And it was fascinating for me to interview Alyssa. I knew nothing about medical illustration before I talked to her for Design Emergency. So learning about her passion and dedication for what to me was an unknown field of design was really interesting. And the global impact of the spiky blob was demonstrated by the plethora of interpretations of it. Many of them reflected our fears of COVID, like these police officers in the Indian city of Chennai, who wore spiky blobbed shaped helmets, shields, and spears made by a local artist, Gautam, literally to scare people into taking the threat of infection seriously. But we soon succumbed to the desire to try and diffuse our dread of COVID-19 by cutesifying it. In the coronavirus braids worn by these girls in Lagos, made for them at a local hair salon, and the homemade piñatas, which this kid in Australia is cheerfully smashing up to vent her fury against the pandemic. We also looked at design's contribution to treating COVID-19, and of course this took many forms. And one of them was delivered by Sehat Kahani, which means Story of Health in Urdu, and was co-founded by two Pakistani doctors, Sara Saeed Karam and Ifad Safar Agar, in 2017, a couple of years before the pandemic struck. Sehed Kahani is a telemedical network that they designed to enable doctor brides, as they're called, like themselves, women who'd qualified at medical school to practice medicine, but had then married and had children and come under such intense cultural and family pressure to stop work that they had indeed stopped practicing. Sara and Ifat decided to use technology to design a way that these doctor brides could practice from their homes, communicating with patients on live video links to small, cheap rental e-clinics throughout Pakistan. When the pandemic began, Sehed Kahani was treating about 350,000 patients, mostly women, a huge achievement. But thanks to Sara and Ifat's decision to launch an app a few months before COVID struck, and the efficiency with which they expanded it during Pakistan's various lockdowns, they are now treating over 9 million people, which promises to make a significant impact in a country of 200 million people, less than half of whom have access to healthcare. Another of our interviewees was the architect behind this. Michael Murphy, the humanitarian designer who co-founded Mass Design Group while a student at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, with a commitment to designing model healthcare systems and infrastructure in places that are woefully under-resourced, like Haiti, where this clinic was built. Mass designed the speedy conversion of the hospitals and clinics that had built in fragile places like Rwanda after Ebola struck, and here in Haiti after the malaria epidemic that followed the devastating 2010 earthquake, to provide beds and resources for COVID patients while separating them from people with other conditions. Also among our interviewees were Roya Mahboob, an Afghan tech entrepreneur who empowered these teenage girls, all star tech students in Herat, the third largest city in Afghanistan, to design and build emergency ventilators. Obviously, this project was completed before the Taliban takeover. Another great project was the New Zealand's public information campaign on COVID-19, which was designed by the local advertising agency Clemenger BBDO. So I interviewed Mark Dalton about it. It was such an intelligent, sensitive and empathic campaign, clear and accurate, really admirable. Also, the same could be said of Federica Fragapane, the information designer responsible for this. Her inspired data visualizations helped us to understand how COVID-19 was behaving. And for Federica, this meant focusing on its relationship to vulnerability in every sense, and why the most fragile members of society in terms of health, wealth, age, ethnicity, housing, and their environments are likeliest to be infected by COVID and to be seriously ill with it, if not die from it. But after 10 weeks of focusing on pandemic design success stories, Paola and I decided to focus on the end game by researching design's potential to help us to build a better future. Now, we made a list of the major challenges that we all face: the housing and refugee crises, failing social systems, the collapse of social justice, the extraordinarily complex intersectional problems caused by the climate emergency, the rise of technophobia and abuses of technology, systemic racism, and other forms of inequality, intolerance, and injustice, the increasingly contentious politics of gender, and more. Now, none of these issues were new, but their impact had intensified and accelerated during the pandemic. We all knew that our world wasn't fit for purpose before COVID, but our problems became far graver as a result of it. The human anguish and the social, economic, and ecological turmoil it caused. So Paola and I then identified the designers, some professional, others not, who we believed were the global design leaders in each of these fields. And critically, all of them had planned and delivered actual practical projects, as opposed to working purely experimentally or conceptually. Not that there's ever anything wrong with that. It has a hugely important role to play in design, but we felt that if we were going to get our message through to the general public, people outside the design community, they needed that proof of practical realization to convince them. Now, having identified those designers, we then tried to ensure that our final selection was as diverse and inclusive as it could be in terms of heritage, geography, age, and gender identity. And we then did our best to persuade them to be interviewed by us for Design Emergency. And we were incredibly lucky that although a couple of people said no, almost all of them said yes. And as a result, we've had the pleasure of conducting some really amazing interviews. Now, one was with Peter Barber, the British architect who has devoted his entire working life over 30 years to designing decent, affordable housing for people who desperately need it, working on tiny budgets on scrappy urban sites like this halfway house in North London, which was designed specifically to help people who've been homeless for long periods and are about to move into what hopefully will be permanent housing to adapt to having a home of their own. Another was A.L. Weizmann, the Israeli-born architect who, by founding Forensic Architecture as a multidisciplinary research agency that uses open source intelligence as well as design and architectural tools to establish the truth behind human rights abuses, man-made disasters and climate crimes, has invented a wholly new role for both design and architecture as tools of restorative social justice. Another was Marina Tabassum, the Bangladeshi architect who's developed ingenious housing solutions for the Rohingya refugees in the world's largest refugee camp in the Cox's Bazar region of Bangladesh, as well as mobile homes for climate victims whose old homes were destroyed by flooding during ferocious monsoons. And here is one of those new homes, designed specifically to be packed up swiftly and moved to higher ground in monsoon floods. Then there was Mohammed Fayez, a brilliant illustrator and activist who depicts the lives of trans and queer people of colour like himself in these fabulously seductive illustrations that also combat stereotypes by revealing their quirks, their eccentricities, their wit, their style, their joy and vulnerabilities to diffuse the cliches about them. And Hilary Cotton, the British social scientist and social design pioneer, who is determined to redesign our social systems and make them fit for purpose, and many, many more. We've conducted over 50 interviews since we started Design Emergency 2 years ago. And rather than rattle off a long list of names, I'm going to talk in detail about why we chose just 3 of them and what we learned from the interviews. And the first concerns an epic design endeavour of our time, one that I have long been obsessed by, the Great Green Wall of Africa. Now, it's an example of the strategic use of design to realise an exceptionally ambitious project in 21 countries in one of the hottest, driest, poorest, and most vulnerable parts of the world by planting and cultivating a 5,000-mile strip of vegetation from Senegal on Africa's west coast to Djibouti on the east coast. It's named the Great Green Wall, which gives it a certain aplomb, but it's really a land restoration programme achieved through crop cultivation. It's also a great example of design's ability to address intensely complex intersectional challenges in which a problem of one type, in this instance drought, not only causes other ecological difficulties, deforestation, desertification, and soil erosion, to name but a few, but also socioeconomic problems of famine, poverty, mass migration, supply shortages, terrorism, and more. Like many of the new genre of epic design endeavours, the Great Green Wall is also a long-running, highly complex and contentious project. It's an African-led venture, led by the African Union, supported by the World Bank, the United Nations, and national governments. The idea originated in the early 1980s, when Thomas Sankara, the radical socialist revolutionary president of Burkina Faso, dreamt it up as a solution to severe drought. But it wasn't until 2007 that it was launched. And by early 2021, it was only 20% completed and seemed doomed to a future of erratic, if not disappointing progress. But then suddenly there was a $14.5 billion pledge from global funders, led by the French government and the World Bank, and subsequently another $5 billion that have given the project a fighting chance of achieving its goal of creating 10 million new green jobs by 2030. Now, it was incredibly difficult to find the right person to interview for this, No one seemed to reply to my endless emails, but when I randomly mentioned it as a favourite design project I was finding it difficult to discover anything about, to one of the professors who'd asked me to give a lecture at the University of the Arts London, she suggested that I should contact two of her former students who'd interned there. They recommended that I should get in touch with the Great Green Wall's head of advocacy, Alexander Assen. Now, Alex was a brilliant interviewee, hugely knowledgeable about the internal politics of the wall, its technical difficulties, its role within African politics, and broader impact during a climate emergency and pandemic that prove we're all vulnerable to problems everywhere on the planet. Very inspiringly, he sees it as a symbol of hope, as he put it, as a wall that brings people together rather than tearing them apart, which is a beautiful way of thinking about it. Now, the second area that we were really desperate to focus on was an interview that again took a long time to pull off while we searched for the correct person to talk to us about design's role in the refugee crisis. Now, this was, for obvious reasons, a top priority. The refugee crisis had been horrific before the pandemic, and of course it was getting worse and worse and worse with all the economic and political instability. But, as I said, it proved very difficult to find the right interviewee, someone with substantial practical experience of the field, but also a knowledge of the politics and strategic thinking that would be needed to resolve it. Now, eventually I found that person through a friend who was working for the United Nations in Iraq. She asked the local UNHCR team there for suggestions, and they unanimously recommended Francesca Coloni. Now, Francesca started out as a civil engineer in her native Italy, but then spent over 20 years designing refugee camps all over the world, including this one, the colossal Zaatari camp in Jordan. But for the past 2 years, she's been based in Geneva as the Chief of Technical Support for the UNHCR's brilliantly named Resilience and Solutions Division. So she oversees design for all the UNHCR's refugee camps worldwide and was fascinating in describing the practical challenges that she and her colleagues face. One is reconciling their determination to be as ecologically responsible as possible with the pressures imposed by the urgency of finding shelter for the more than 2,000 refugees who were arriving every night when Francesca was working at the Zaatari camp. I mean, if all they've got is plastic to make temporary tents, what is she supposed to do? Deny them a roof to sleep under for the night. Another is the elemental compromise whereby the UNHCR has been trying to phase out refugee camps, as human rights organisations have been lobbying it to do since 2014 in favour of more flexible and sustainable solutions, only to be stymied again by the sheer numbers of new arrivals with each new crisis. Number 3 is balancing the need to provide urgent support for new arrivals with the knowledge that many refugee camps are bigger than most major towns and cities, and that many of their occupants will spend many years there, experiencing the birth of children and the death of elders. Zaatari, this camp, is now the 4th largest city in Jordan. And while over 1 million people live in the settlements in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, where Marina Tabassum also works. Massive challenge number 4 is making the most of the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the camp's residents, like the Syrian refugees, who, according to Francesca, are so entrepreneurial, they open markets in camps like the Zaatari within days of their arrival, or the residents of the Nakivale refugee camp in Uganda on the border or near the border with Tanzania, who've transformed it from a camp 50 years ago into a town with a constantly changing population as refugees come and go, changing its name from camp to settlement. Now, a third interviewee who specialises in a completely different field, but whose interview, which Paola did brilliantly, was equally compelling, is Kate Crawford, the Australian technologist who shared a fascinating analysis of the pros and very significant cons of artificial intelligence. Now, Kate probed the increasingly damaging problem of data bias in AI systems, which, because they're modelled on existing data, are prone to perpetuating historic prejudices and bigotry. And that's why, say, the interviewees suggested by AI recruitment software for senior management roles tend to be white cis males, because there's no data to suggest that anyone else could fulfill them. But the algorithms also have no information to suggest that women, people who identify as non-binary, and people of colour should be considered too. And this leads to misogynistic and racist errors that are plaguing artificial intelligence already, whether it's recruitment apps or biometric surveillance systems, which are now ubiquitous in public places. Equally ominous is the horrific environmental impact of AI, and many other powerful technologies come to that. We tend to think of the ecological problems caused by technology in material terms, of depleted raw materials, precious metals in particular, and digital graveyards like the notoriously fetid and criminalistic Abgaboshi dump in Ghana. But AI programs are so complex that they consume colossal quantities of data and emit equally vast quantities of carbon dioxide, often in isolated rural locations, causing massive environmental damage. And as AI becomes increasingly ubiquitous, as Kate believes it's inevitable that it will, we urgently need to crack these problems and also to take radical action to prevent the continuation of the exploitative employment practices of low wages and inadequate job security that are rife throughout the AI sector. Now, Paola and I also developed a way to explore the implications of sudden emergencies by scheduling what we called special editions, often by inviting relevant specialists to discuss contentious issues such as this, the Beirut blast in Lebanon. This is one of forensic architecture's investigations into the cause and impact of it, systemic racism after the Black Lives Matter protests, and the tragic and terrible West Coast wildfires, which have caused such devastation. Now, one of the reasons why we chose Instagram as the platform for our interviewees was its flexibility. It made it very easy because we could conduct and record the interviews on the IG Live platform and then stream them on our video channel. And as Paola and I both had fairly large Instagram followings before Design Emergency's arrival, we could use the post and stories functions on them to promote each interview and other Design Emergency projects we launched. Instagram is also nimble enough for us to change our plans at very short notice when necessary. For example, when I was researching Ukraine's design response to Russia's war for my own feed, and here are some of the posts, in March, I came across a remarkably ambitious and resourceful architect, Slava Balbek, of Balbek Bureau in Kyiv. And I have to point out that Slava, brilliant though he is, was one of many extraordinary resourceful Ukrainian designers, architects, and engineers I met during the research. He was not only running a food and delivery hub that distributes meals to 13,000 people every day throughout Kyiv, as well as humanitarian aid throughout any newly liberated areas of Afghanistan, but developing design templates for temporary refugee housing during construction work after the war ended, and modular ways of protecting and documenting Ukraine's beloved historic monuments. So we quickly scheduled an IG Live interview with him, and you can see us in the middle of the screen. But effective though Instagram has been for us, it also became clear at an early stage, partly because the response to Design Emergency on Instagram had been so enthusiastic, that we should also produce a book. And we did a test run in 2000 when Wallpaper magazine contacted Paola and I out of the blue and invited us to be guest editors of its October 2000 issue in our guises as co-founders of Design Emergency. Now, Wallpaper does a guest edited issue every year, but typically it's a famous fashion designer or architect who edits it. But they felt very sensibly, given the context of the pandemic, that they would like to have a very different spirit, and so decided to use our content on Design Emergency. Now, it combined 9 of the interviews we conducted, mostly ones focusing on the design response to COVID, with profiles of Paola and I, and of course Frith, who designed the special issue for us. Now, again, the response was really great, well beyond our highest expectations, suggesting to us that a book could be equally successful. So we circulated a proposal to publishers for one with 25 edited and updated interviews, all focusing on the future of design, not COVID specifically, and divided into 4 sections: technology, society, communication, and ecology, plus specially written essays by Paula and I on the broader context. And here is the book, Design Emergency, Building a Better Future, which was launched worldwide by our publisher Phaidon last week, and again is beautifully designed by Frith and her colleagues. Our hope is that by providing practical solutions or insights into them to the daunting intersectional challenges, the book will make a convincing case for design to be taken seriously as a social, political, and environmental tool, and that it will also demonstrate, particularly to young people, the incredible diversity of design, and that there are many, many different ways of practicing it, especially if you're using design to tackle your favourite activist causes, whether that's homelessness, technophobia, climate crimes, or the social justice crisis. Now, Paula and I have been thrilled with the great response to the book and have also found it enjoyable, enlightening, and instructive to have had the opportunity to discuss the work and future plans of so many brilliant designers throughout the project. And as a way of getting you through an otherwise entirely dire global pandemic, I strongly recommend it, because you're constantly dealing and engaging with incredible people, giving us hope and optimism and solutions for the future. Now, some of the people we interviewed are long-standing friends of ours. Others we met solely through Design Emergency, and that has continued. Now, given that there are many eminent design researchers among you, I have to stress that neither Paula nor I is under any illusion that researching design through such a flexible digital platform as Instagram, as we've done with Design Emergency, is in any way equivalent to the rigor, discipline, and intensity of academic research, proper design research like yours. We usually describe Design Emergency as a research platform, and it is in a way, but when I was preparing this talk, it struck me that it would be much more accurate to call it a communication platform, because that's really its forte, to enable people, particularly those outside the design community, to engage with and learn about diverse aspects of design in a fun and accessible way. Now, hopefully some of those people will then go on to read your research or to produce it themselves. And regardless, Paula and I hope that our work at Design Emergency will serve as a lively and engaging addition to design culture by encouraging more and more people to share our love of design and our belief in its ability, when it's applied intelligently, sensitively, and responsibly, to give us hope for the future by helping us to build a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's open the, thank you, Alice, for this amazing lecture. Let's open now the Q&A session. First, would like to give the word to those that are physically here with us in the room. And afterwards, we could get some questions from the remote audience, okay? So Alice, I have a question that is sometimes when we try to advocate this design perspective, some people reply us saying that this seems like charity. So there's an understanding or a misunderstanding, it's better saying, that they confusing this social contribution of design as charity. Or sometimes they say this is an approach only targeting minority groups or specific groups. It's not a universal approach. And so they see us as activists more than mainstream designers. So in your experience, how should we address this kind of mindsets when we are confronted with them?
Well, it's a great question, Amelia, and obviously they're complex issues, but I think one of the reasons we launched Design Emergency was to address that mindset with practical examples. And so many of the people we interviewed are either legally operating as nonprofits or effectively on a nonprofit basis. But there are other designers who run very successful commercial design consultancies. One would be the British interior designer, Ilse Crawford. She has a very successful practice that designs products for IKEA, George Jensen, and many other mainstream well-known brands, but only designs them within the criteria that she judges appropriate. So that's conceptually and also ecologically. And also she takes on pro bono projects. So a very beautiful one that we focused on in the book is Refectorio Felix, which was a very shabby community kitchen in West London, which, working with a tiny budget at breakneck speed, Ilse and her colleagues turned into such an attractive and appealing place that the entire community kitchen is now funded by the money that the charity who runs it gets by renting it out for kids' parties, adults' dance parties, and so on. And so we really have tried to paint as varied and diverse and inclusive a picture of designers as we can. I mean, somebody like Peter Barber, who's devoted his career to social housing, isn't a fat, rich cat or rich, fat cat architect, but that's his choice. He decided to do something that he's absolutely passionate about, and he would wear the activist badge that you've mentioned with pride. But we live in an age of activism, and more students, recent graduates, and young designers are proud to be activists. They want to use their skills, knowledge, and experience in addressing these complex issues that I've been talking about. And I've been writing about this aspect of design for many, many years. And when I wrote Hello World, Where Design Meets Life, which was in the very early 2010s, I found incredible examples to add to the book, but I really had to search hard for them. Now I'm spoilt for choice. I mean, there's so much amazing work going on, so many really great networks being founded to enable designers working in a commercial context who can't afford to work on pro bono or activist projects full time to be able to do so part-time, for example, or in intensive periods in holidays. And I think if you believe that design is important, that as a society we need the best possible practitioners as designers, the more options they have to practice design, the better. It will be much more attractive to them. And so that's why I think this is more and more important.
Thank you so much. I have here another question. I told you.
Thank you, Alice, very much for being today with us. It's a pleasure. We are very glad to have you among us. After all this experience you have in identifying good solutions, the work these amazing designers are doing in order to tackle challenges everywhere, I would like to know if you have identified some commonalities, common points, common ways or methods to intervene in this context to find these solutions. Do you see some commonalities between the designers or the interventions, or they are totally different? Did you find some common patterns, let's say?
That's very interesting. I have to admit, that's not an issue I've thought about. I mean, all of them are hugely gifted, very dedicated designers, very imaginative, their work's ingenious, it's resilient, it's resourceful and inspiring. And as I said of Peter Barber, if they were told, perhaps by a more conventional designer who wants it to remain a commercial domain, that they're activists, they would typically be very proud to bear that label. So I think the qualities they have in common tend to be those sort of elemental ones in terms of their dedication and the nature of their approach. I think the fact that they are all such original and resourceful and ingenious designers means that often the way they approach the projects are very, very different. And in the case of someone like, say, A.L. Weisman of forensic architecture, which he still runs from Goldsmiths University in Southeast London, where he founded it over a decade ago. He has pioneered an entirely new medium of design and design discipline in the use of open source intelligence. And obviously we've seen open source intelligence, the video clips and smartphone images in the Ukraine war, and how helpful it has been in accelerating, for example, the war crime trial that happened last week with the young Russian tank commander. They knew that Russia would veto Ukraine's attempts to persuade the European Court of Justice and the European Criminal Court to try it as a war crime. And so they use the open source intelligence to produce incontrovertible evidence captured on the ground of what had happened. Now, technically, it wouldn't have been possible for that evidence to have been produced by, you know, people like all of us with our cell phones, with such what now seems to us basic technology 10, 20 years ago. So Eyal is a brilliant example of a designer who is dedicated to architecture, but now applies architecture tools as ways of reconstructing contentious issues and contentious incidents and finding out the truth of exactly what happened there and who is responsible. So restorative justice for the victims and their families can be secured. So one of the fun things about Design Emergency has been seeing the multifarious ways in which all the designers, who are dramatically different characters, have approached their goals, but recognizing that their shared values are the determination, the dedication, the imagination, the resilience, which has been very inspiring.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon or good evening, Alice. Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. I have a €1 million, £1 million for your London question. Based on your interviews and on your experience as journalists and design critics, how should designers be in order to change the world? I mean, do we need like superheroes that challenge patterns and paradigms, or more humble professionals? I mean, how should designers be in order to really change something in the world? Thank you.
Again, a fascinating question. I think they should be themselves. I mean, some of the interviewees, I mean, I mentioned Slava Bablek, the Ukrainian architect and designer who flung himself, I think on day one after the Russian invasion, he took his wife and family and his in-laws to safe refuge in Western Ukraine, then returned to Kyiv, volunteered for the militia, was told that it was absolutely full, bursting to capacity, you know, no more ammunition to hand out, and so decided he would help the civilian war effort instead. So he set up this food and delivery hub because that was what people needed, you know, to take people to stations, deliver supplies throughout the country, and then decided that he would focus on these sort of future-facing projects of protecting and documenting the monuments and developing the temporary refugee housing, which President Zelensky has agreed to construct on a trial basis outside Kyiv. Now, he's an incredibly dynamic, I think he's an Iron Man, so he's a very alpha male figure. So he perhaps fulfills the stereotype of the sort of swaggering designer, brimful of ambition and determination, but, you know, has behaved impeccably responsibly throughout, whereas others are very modest about their achievements and, as you suggested, more self-effacing about them, but equally dedicated and equally ingenious in devising solutions for them. And also many of them are far better known within other fields than in the design community. So one of the few that has straddled both, but is still better known in her original field, is Hilary Cottam, the social scientist turned social designer I talked about, who wants to redesign the UK's welfare state and our social systems. She wrote an excellent book, which I would urge you all to read, a couple of years ago, called Radical Help, which defines her vision of these redesigned systems in the future to make them fit for purpose. And it is essential reading for social science students, social scientists, and people in related fields. She has a reasonably high profile in the design sector, but nowhere near as high as it is within her own specific field. So these things vary greatly. And we interviewed very famous designers like Neri Oxman, for example, the technologist, inventor, and architect who's absolutely committed to regenerating biodiversity, and by encouraging us to design not just for humans, but for all the other species with whom we share this planet, and has produced extraordinary experiments to enable her to do this. So there's a huge diversity of the interviewees, and just as they have very different approaches, they're very different characters.
Just want to add that you took the words out of my mouth, because I was saying that some people say that human-centric design is destroying us, or is leading us to the catastrophe. And maybe we should change the paradigm into something else, like humanity-centric design, or even planet-centric design, or even, I don't know, maybe universe-centric design. Then that's the big discussion these days. I don't know if you have any idea about this, or if you want to elaborate a little bit more.
Well, I think it's a fascinating and very worthwhile and important discussion. And, a few years ago, there were massive debates around what interspecies design really meant. And what is thrilling now is to see extraordinary designers like Neri cracking on and experimenting with it. Another designer who Paola interviewed, who I'll be interviewing at a symposium in Milan next week, is Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, all of whose work is completely focused on boosting biodiversity and forging a natural balance between other species and us. And in her current and most ambitious project, she is very much focused on prioritizing other species, not humans. It's called Pollinator Path Makers. And it is large expanses of garden. The first is at the Eden Project in Cornwall in the southwest coast of England. The second is in Kensington Gardens in London, a collaboration with the Serpentine Gallery. And the third will be in Berlin. So these are large expanses of garden which are planted as an algorithm decrees that they should be planted to attract pollinators to that particular area in an optimal way, as many pollinators as possible, and to enable them to feast on the pollen that the plants produce in the most productive way. So there are more and more of these practical experiments going on, and I think there's a huge public interest in them.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for your talk here. In terms of those cases for biodiversity protection and so on, there are more and more cases, but they are all experimental. So there is a huge gap between an innovation or any innovation until a mass application of those innovation. So my question is, what is the role of us here as a field to close the gap between hugely necessary innovation to a mass application that can not only solve all the problems we have, but avoid the future problems, specifically in terms of climate change, biodiversity
It's a very valid and important question again. And my answer would be the epic design endeavors like the Great Green Wall. I mean, I think nothing could be more of a mass application than it. It's this hugely ambitious project to plant and then sustain and cultivate 5,000 miles of greenery from one African coast to another across the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. It involves 21 different countries, all working in their own way at a mass level and approaching it in very different ways. So for example, Burkina Faso, its priority has been to sort of experiment with the reintroduction of traditional agricultural techniques. So digging techniques that enable the available water in areas where it's sparse to be used to maximum advantage to irrigate the plants, whereas other countries like Senegal have tended to focus on tree planting. Now, this is a massive endeavor. It has encountered many problems, and often there'll be countries that make huge advances and then because of sudden changes in their geopolitics or socioeconomics, they can no longer continue to focus on the wall. So Ethiopia would be an excellent example of that. They were making really good progress until 2 years ago when civil war erupted and paralyzed the entire country, including the Great Green Wall's progress. And so I think that we have to accept that if design is going to tackle these massive, ambitious, global, as you say, mass challenges, it needs to think very ambitiously and very rigorously. And the brutal truth is that every success will make it easier for other designer activists and their peers to raise funding, secure political and public support for their projects in future, and every failure will make it more difficult. And so this really needs to be a collective effort across the design community, among the designers who are interested in working like this, to work in very different, much more imaginative and challenging and demanding ways. But so many of the projects we looked at really have made incredible progress. I mean, the Great Green Wall estimated that it needed $40 billion to be completed. Within the last 12 months, they have raised $20 billion of it. That is a huge amount of money, and it will make a massive difference in their ability to deliver.
I think there's someone from the remote audience. Is Francesco Valli raised the hand? Francesco, please.
Hi, Emilia. Thanks so much, and thanks so much, Alice. I don't know if it's a question. First of all, congratulations. I also talked with Paula, and I'm following you since the beginning of the pandemic because you have done a great job. But let me speculate. If we assume that design is a capitalistic discipline, we can also assume that the capitalistic emergency, it's also part of the problem. And look like to me that you are trying to solve the problem at the same level at which the problem was created. That's why, yes, it's an emergency, but this emergency was designed. And nobody is talking about why it was designed. The same like the conflict. The conflict was designed, is designed, but nobody is trying to talk about the reason why it was designed. And we try to, first of all, congratulations, we try to resolve the problem. This is a quote from Einstein. And it's a paradigm, it's a dilemma, because we have no option. We try to resolve the problem at the same level in which the problem was created. And that is my reflection. But anyway, Emilia, thanks so much for the time that you spend, and Alice, congratulations for the project you have done with Paola. But it's not a question, it's a reflection.
Indeed, and I understand the thinking behind the point, but I don't believe design is I believe it's a partially capitalistic discipline, and that its capitalistic role was its predominant one during the industrial age, but I think it has always had a very different agenda, which until recently was very much at the margins of design culture. You know, we always had public-spirited, ecologically responsible mavericks, whether it's Laszlo Molinage or Bucky Fuller. You know, Fuller identified the environmental damage being caused by industrialization as early as the 1920s and urged young designers to devote their careers to fighting it. They ignored him, and we can see the carnage that has followed. And so those sort of maverick activist characters were very much on the margins of design culture throughout the 20th century. But I mean, the key theme of my book, Design as an Attitude, is how very basic digital technologies have transformed the practice and possibilities of design by enabling designers to raise funding for their projects through crowdfunding, grants and other means digitally, to promote them through social media. I mean, the fact that Paula and I can literally start a project like Design Emergency, which obviously has dominated our lives for much of the last 2 years, though we've both also been involved in many other projects. And it makes me feel slightly exhausted when I look at actually everything that's done. But at the time, it was the logical thing to do and great fun. And I'm very glad we did it. But actually, we haven't invested any money in it other than presents and, you know, donations to the Ukrainian designers and so on. So I just think that because of changes in technology, you know, not just social media and crowdfunding platforms, but the fact that affordable computers can now manipulate huge quantities of very complex data, which is essential for the work of social designers like Hilary Cottam, technologists like Kate Crawford. I do believe this has liberated designers from their industrial role, so more and more of them can approach design in an improvisational way and use it to address their favorite causes, whether it's combating the climate emergency, tackling the homelessness crisis, or whatever. So I genuinely believe, I'm a very optimistic character, as you're probably gathering, that this is a golden age of design when there are so many more possibilities for designers and so many brilliant examples of designers who seize them.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Thanks. I understand that you are absolutely positive thinker, optimistic. I'm much more negative. That's why probably I'm much more influenced by negative knowledge. That's why my negative question. But thanks so much. I absolutely appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Great question. Very provocative.
Yeah. Just, I don't know if there's anyone with their hand raised. No? I have a final question, maybe. It's Mariana Mazzucato. It's an Italian economist. She advocates that we should follow this mission-based economy. And my question is, if we should follow this strategy, which mission should we prioritize?
Oh,
in your opinion?
Thank you for ending on that. I mean, I actually think the mission is one of individual responsibility. It's given that I do believe that designers genuinely have many more choices, options, and possibilities to explore now, and the means with which to do so economically and culturally and also technologically. I think that it is absolutely essential that they only embark upon these projects if they're fully cognizant of the risks involved. You know, with greater ambition comes greater responsibility, and the consequences of failure become far, far graver. And not only because, as I said, there's a collective sense of responsibility that if one of these projects fails, it suddenly makes it much more difficult for all the others. And I believe that every designer, and this is going to sound very swotty and moralistic, but should embark on every design project, whether it's capitalistic or activist, with an open mind and good and honest intentions, and the highest possible sense of ethical responsibility, because otherwise, frankly, what's the point? So that would be my answer, rather than a specific mission. I think that's for designers to identify for themselves. It's really the attitude and the sense of ethics that's so important.
So Alice, once again, thank you so much for your time and for your contributions. And I think that in the near future, we should invite you to come here to see our projects, since we have a lot of students addressing these design emergency topics. And so I will send you a second invitation. This time we want you to be physically here in Lisbon, enjoying the good weather and the good food with us. And so just to thank you once again on behalf of IADE and UNIDCOM for your time, and let's keep in touch. In the meanwhile, I'm sure that if you have any questions, I will be glad to share it with Alice. And thank you so much.
Oh, well, Emilia, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to all of you. You've asked brilliant questions. And it's been lovely to talk to you, and I only wish it was in lovely Lisbon, which genuinely is one of my favourite cities. So great to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. Bye-bye. See you next time.
Thank you.